Here's another game by Anatoly Karpov in which he played against the Sicilian defense in the positional style. This is the game against Giorgadze from 1983, where Karpov was playing with the white pieces. After e4, c5, knight f3, we got into the Najdorf variation, and as usual at the time, Karpov played the bishop e2 line. Here Black has a choice to go into Scheveningen with e6, but instead he went into the typical Najdorf line with bishop with pawn to e5. Knight retreats. Both sides develop, and here the most common move is bishop to e6. The idea is that Black has the semi-open c file on which he wants to put the pressure, and White has the outpost on d5 on which he wants to put the knight. So then the play could continue like this. The main line goes queen to d2, knight b to d7, a4, rook c8. So notice that Black begins all his play on the c file. Now he wants to go knight to b6 and then knight to c4, and then he wants to capture with the rook. So White usually goes pawn to a5, preventing the knight from coming to b6, and then only then Black goes queen to c7, putting pressure on c2. The idea is that he finally stopped the knight from coming to here, because then he could just take and then takes, and he would take on c2. So Black only plays queen c7 when the rook is already on c8, and that helps him to prevent knight d5. By playing queen to c7, it's a little bit harder to organize his play the same way. Queen to d2, and now again would be still probably possible to transpose into the lines above with bishop to e6, but he went rook to e8, which is, I guess, fine. A bit of a slow waiting move. He's waiting to see what White's gonna do. Is White gonna play a4? Is White gonna go f4? Is White gonna go knight d5? So he's just waiting for now. White goes pawn to a4. That possibly creates the threat of playing to a5 and then bishop to b6. So Black covers a5. Goes bishop to f3. Bishop e6. Now White begins to transfer the second knight towards d5. So he goes knight to c1. The idea is to come around and to bring this knight to d5, which takes time, but is still a reasonable plan. Black finishes development with knight to c6, and now finally White goes knight to d5. That hits the queen and the bishop, and after, say, knight takes on d5, then, well, this is just not possible, because then that would win a piece. So Black at this point has to take with the bishop instead. White captures back, and now he's got a bit of a space advantage, and he has two bishops. So knight has to go to the edge of the board, threatening to come to c4, so Karpov covers that square with b3. Now Black puts pressure on the c file, but it's easy for White to defend against that. The knight now gets transferred to probably a better square on c5, because after b3 there was nothing for it to do on a5, rook d1, and for the next few moves Karpov just kind of consolidates. He improves the position of all his pieces. So the rook is best placed on d1. Now he was a bit worried about Black going, say, knight to e4, either this knight or the other knight, so he just anticipates that and retreats in advance. Goes queen b7. Now again Karpov wants to improve the position of this bishop, so he goes g3, so that later the bishop can draw back to g2. Black doesn't have very active plans either, so he just also plays slowly. Now Karpov improved all his pieces. The rook is guarding a2, the bishop is putting pressure on the knight. This knight is waiting to come out to d3, but not ready yet. The rook and the bishop are also very well placed. So Karpov starts to generate play on the queen side. He undermines the supporter of the c5 knight. Black has to advance the pawn. If he captures, then I suppose just this a pawn is going to be very weak in the long run. So he plays b5, and this now creates some very good target squares for the white knight. And earlier the b4 wasn't so great for the knight because black could possibly play a5 and cover up that square. Now the pawn structure has been resolved, and that's no longer possible. So Karpov transfers the knight to c6. He takes on c5. Now black cannot capture on c5 with the pawn, because if he does, then e5 hangs, or d6. So he has to take with the rook, and now the knight has a very clear road to c6. Now in this position, Karpov has recommended in his book to play rook to c7, so that when the knight comes to c6, so that the rook is already guarding the bishop, just kind of to gain tempo. That was his idea, but he overlooked that there's knight e5 shot, which just gives white a very big advantage, because now the bishop is hitting the rook, the pawn is hitting the bishop, so this is very good for white. So rook c to c8 was just fine. Now Karpov of course carries on with knight to b4. And now again, Karpov has a considerable advantage. He has a very strong knight. This bishop is quite strong. He can possibly create play against these pawns. So this position is just better for white. In the game, black played pawn to e4, and later this pawn became quite weak. Had he tried to do something else, white would still be much better. For example, he goes queen f5, then white can go c4. And after the exchanges, white now has a few nice plans. For one thing, because he's supporting his play on the queen side with the knight, he could start to go for the b file. Say rook to b2 and then rook to b7. And black cannot put anything on b8, so this would be a nice plan. Another option is to create play on the king side and say, now that the third rank is open, maybe transfer the rook to here, maybe prepare f4 under good circumstances. So say g6, rook e3, bishop g7, bishop c2, and suddenly white's prepared to play pawn to e4 and create pressure on the king side. And say if black tries to trade off that knight, then he can exploit the fact that this bishop is much better than that bishop. So there's a lot of small advantages in white's position, and black's play would be quite difficult in any case. In the game, black played pawn to e4 and collapsed very soon. Here it makes sense, I guess, to take with the queen to put pressure on a6 immediately. Queen to f5, and now white just builds up pressure on e4, and we'll see why that matters so much. h5, and now black is putting counter pressure on d5. So if the rook moves, it seems, so if the rook goes here, then it seems like black could take on d5. But it turns out that the pressure against e4 is more important, and Karpov calculates carefully that taking on e4 is going to win the game for him. So he goes rook to e1, and there's no defense for the e4 pawn now. Black tries to capture on d5, but it turns out that in this position the pressure on the e-file is more important than anything else, because white also threatens to play something like bishop to h7 and win the rook on e8, double attack. So, and the knight at the same time has to go somewhere. So he tried to go to c7 to guard both rooks, but then another discovered check came through. So bishop to h7 no longer works, of course, because now the rook is just guarded, and white's going to be down a piece here. But the other check works really well. So he goes knight to e7, and now the bishop is hitting on a8. After rook takes, otherwise white just wins the exchange for free. He captured here, now the rook hangs, so he has to exchange on e2. And after knight takes, it seems the black won 2 pieces for a rook, so he may be doing quite fine here, but it turns out that one of his pieces is so badly placed that he's gonna lose it no matter what. So after rook c2, black just had to resign. This bishop is still so passive, so it cannot support the knight, and there's nothing to do about rook to c8, and then just white's gonna win the knight, win the pawn, queen the a pawn. The d pawn is not going anywhere. It's just too many squares to go. So the critical moment in this game probably came when Karpov nicely sensed that in this pawn structure, his knight on c1 has really great squares, and it's worth giving up a bishop. And after that transformation, with this knight, he has a very long-term positional advantage, and it didn't take him too long to exploit that advantage. Another example that in the Sicilian defense, white doesn't have to play on the king side. He can generate some play on the queen side, and that should give him a solid advantage, like it did in this game.